Right. One of the big topics for this one, and the reason why I ask that question, Zabatine, is at the moment, the split began, actually funnily enough in LCS, with all these weird benchings, right? Where it's not just like a player who is bad at the game, that's an obvious reason to bench anyone in any sport. It's basically players where they're actually some of the biggest names and arguably some of the best players for these teams. It's also spread a little bit to LEC, like we've already had SK Gaming, and now there's the whole Vitality thing where they swapped in a few players. But I want to get your take as someone who was actually a coach in LCS, because I want to start on the NA side. This is going to be mainly an LEC episode, but I thought in light of your coaching history, it might be interesting to get your take. So what do you actually think about this? Because as I even alluded to there, if we look at the difference between the LEC and the LCS benchings, the LEC ones seem to be more based around like literally performance. Like this guy isn't doing well this week and we're going to bring in this other player, or we have some reason why, the team isn't working out. The LCS one, I've noticed, it doesn't seem like almost anyone except for insiders actually know even the real reasons. It's always like a different reason given, like, we felt like this guy should be promoted, or maybe this guy's having issues that mean he can't play. Like, when you were over in the region, listen, those two teams you were working with, Optic and Mortars, obviously they had their own periods where they benched a whole bunch of players, or one player came up and down out of academy. What would you say about the whole topic? Like, why do you think, for example, Zabatine, that it's like a big issue now? In the past, maybe it was at one or two people. Seems like a lot of teams are kind of flexing the bench angle now. What do you think? Why is it such a phenomenon, do you think?
I think, aside from Team Liquid, which is a very specific case, I think that the teams that don't belong to the top already know that they're not really belonging to the top. They're trying to experiment, and I think the problem is it's very hard. I think for as I mentioned sometimes, especially in my French shows, that it doesn't really encapsulate into a vision that's provided by the team to the audience. And people are very surprised by everything that's going on because they just like watch teams kind of, flipping players from academy to main team and vice versa all the time. And they feel like there is no continuity. I think when you're behind the stage, you really want to try as many options as you can. And you're always trying to find a way to make it work one way or the other. But I think I made this mistake personally in my career of thinking that switching a player might actually, kind of recreate a dynamic or make a team do better. But usually, except if you change the whole team, and you just start something fresh, it's putting efforts, especially on an individual basis, whether it's the staff, whether it's the players, usually fix problems in a much deeper way than actually just switching, a player. Except if you have this performance justification, like your academy, top laner is insane, winning every single side of every single matchup, then you just put him on the field because he's better. But if it's a matter of team system, I think that work with the individual works better than just a swap, because if there is a problem and you bench a player because there is a problem, it's he's already affected by the problem because he's not winning, and then he gets benched, and then the audience doesn't understand, and then it just snowballs. So I don't think it's not easy for staff, because I don't think that it's very time is a resource when you're working 9 weeks in a straight. But that's definitely something that needs to be addressed for the the future generations of players. We have a bunch of rookies and want to develop talent. That has been the main topic for LCS in the last 2-3 years. That's how do we individually follow these players in a way that with the back and forth and in their performance, they will feel like they're developing. And for the ones that are established, when they have to give their spot to another one that's probably better, how do we communicate that to the audience in a way that people understand that it's a vision coming on the long term from the management and not just something that comes out of the box every 2 weeks or so? I think that's a big problems I see.
Okay. You have any thoughts, Wicked?
So I don't really think the change is necessarily bad. Some of them have my own opinions, right? But we don't have all the information because we're not behind the scenes. So from my perspective, I don't know if they're bad or good, but my big problem is the communication, because the communication ruins it for the fans. They give us absolutely nothing, so you have nothing to even take at. And then the players, it also hurts their reputation a lot, right? And if I was a player on a team and I got benched, but the reason wasn't said and people were making 1,000 different speculations, I would suddenly lose confidence in my team, because I'd be like, what's going on? You guys look like a clown organization to some extent, right? So I have a big problem with the communication, and I think that's something NA teams really need to focus on, because it's going to hurt the fans, it's going to hurt people watching the sport, esports, and it's also going to hurt the players and the team in the long run. So I think it's really, really sad the way they're doing it. And I think the best way to do it is give a little hint of the truth, give a little bit of the truth, but it doesn't have to be the entire truth, right? You don't have to air all the laundry out, but just give a little bit of the truth. I think Excel did a fantastic job. I think almost all other organizations that I've seen in recent times did a terrible job.
Yeah. But to pick up on what you're saying there, I definitely agree with that, like the latter point. Like, I actually think I can tie both points together, which is the point that Zabatine's saying here, where they don't really, like, the orgs are doing a terrible job of communicating basically what, like, the premise of the team is supposed to be. Because what I would describe it as is this, right? It's very different if you, this is how I can tie the 2 points together. I agree, actually, by the way, Excel did a great job with how they announced it. Like, they didn't basically say, like, well, this Dan guy can't do X, Y, and Z, so he's kicked, which would obviously ruin his whole rep, and everyone would just think he was dead. And then also you imply that, like, you know, it was impossible to fix with that player. What you do instead, because I've noticed Youngbuck throughout his whole career has done this, like famously when he was on Fnatic, even though I know he didn't think Broxah was even close to the best jungler, his way of explaining how they would work around that and what the flaws were, it never sounded like he made Broxah the problem. It was like, we have issues with how we communicate with the lanes and the jungler, you know, like in this situation, he would make it like vague enough that he was giving you the real story, like he was telling you what the problems were, but in a way that, as you say, it didn't like make it so that like the idiot fan was like, oh, just this player can't do it. Because if you think about it, right, if you actually just say, essentially, the team concept was we were going to play in a certain way and we're having a problem with this area of it. We can't get this certain aspect working. If you make it vague enough like that, but you are still giving real reasons, it doesn't have to be that the player that was removed is actually a bad player. He might, like, for example, maybe in your team it turned out the jungler has to communicate more. You actually have one of the best junglers. He's just not a very vocal player, or he's a player who prefers to take feedback rather than get. Well, in that case, he could be a very good jungler, just not for your team. Like, I actually agree. I think that's part of where it all comes from, by the way, is in the past, I think people probably would have just sort of said, fuck the player, and just sort of said, yeah, we're having these problems, which in the short term takes the blame off you as the org, because fans are like, oh, he's just not a good player. But I agree. Unfortunately, it's going to mean a lot of players are going to kind of get labelled a certain way, and in LEC case, they might never get another chance. And I know a lot of coaches and even pro players at the moment are like a bit nervous about that topic because they've seen too many people come into LEC or be in LCS and basically get benched after like a split, half a split, and then you see these names never come back. And sometimes whatever the label is, toxic, can't communicate, can't do whatever, nerves on stage is a classic one. If you get labelled with that, that can last years. I mean, here's an example, right? Even though he wasn't benched, when Abedage first came into Schalke, in the first year, because people were wondering, well, he's not really as good in LEC as he was in ERLs, a bunch of people on his team said stuff like, oh, well, he's a little bit more introverted, you know, he's not as communicative. Dude, that has continued to this day. Like, I actually have tried asking some people who've been in teammates, and they're like, oh, no, that was years ago, you had those problems. Like, but a fan who doesn't know that, like, the story got updated, they think, like, you know, you're just a guy who never talks ever in the game, and, you know, he's having all these same issues. So, yeah, I think it's a super complicated topic, but I can certainly see why some of the issues are coming around. What do you think on that, though, Zabatine? Because I think Wicked addressed it pretty well, but I know that is what a lot of coaches are going to tell me. They're going to tell me, like, oh, but I can't give any info away, or, you know, if I tell people what I'm trying to do, they can guess things. I kind of agree with Wicked. You can sort of give, like, a hint of it, right? Without like, betraying your strategy or what you're trying to do in the team. Like, you're not really, like, the other team knows the scouting report, surely.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have two cases, right, where you're gonna bench someone because of underperformance. Like, you clearly someone that's not performing well, and you don't have the time to treat the issue on time for the next match, the next week, or for your performance deadline by the end of the split. And you're just gonna swap someone that's like fresh and ready because he's just performing probably on par, but works better in a shorter term. That happens. That's the worst case because you don't really have a communication besides, I mean, at this very specific moment, and it's something that my A player is not providing, and you don't want to go on, you know, facing the public and saying that. And you have the other one, which is much easier to communicate around, which I think is probably the case that Wicked is speaking about, which is like, oh, you have a specific system that you don't want to disclose fully, but you have found probably like a way to play that's better. Like, for instance, I don't know, you have a top laner that wants to play with all the resources, and then you eventually recognize that your team is working much better if you play around the bot side, and you have on the academy a top laner that's going to play much more around the without resources, not playing, like, the team doesn't need to play toward his lane and stuff, and then it works. But then you have a positive communication to say, oh, we found out that, you know, the chemistry works better, and we have a better expression of every single individuals in that system and stuff, and it makes it much better. I think the first case is the worst because as an organization, you have nothing to say besides, you know, we are short on time, and that happens. I think to any coach you will get here. It's like, we are short on time. We saw that it works slightly better with someone from the academy. Want to try him and want to see if it works. If it transitions from scrims, because it works on scrims obviously first. If it transitions on stage, but there is nothing you can do besides saying, oh, this academy player is performing pretty well. We're gonna try him, and people are like, oh, so the other one suck? No, he doesn't suck. He's not performing on par. with what we expect him to do, or he doesn't feel like performing at this level, or the meta doesn't fit him that way. But it's very hard to communicate that, because anyway the fans will transition into translate into, oh, the org says the players suck, which is not right.
Mm-hmm.
That's my POV on it.
I think in that case, what you could easily do, like, let's say you're like a 9th place team, like what are they called, FlyQuest right now? Then I think one thing you could do is like, yo, right now we're in trouble. It's not looking very good. We need to be top 8 for the playoffs. If we put in this player, we think our chances are slightly higher, but it's not a big difference. So we have to make this roster swap just to try and make playoffs or something like that. Because they're still giving the kind of truth in the story of they want to make playoffs. So they're trying anything they can try, right? But I feel like the latest news was simply just like, oh, it just happened. And you don't get anything at all, right? And then everyone's just speculating everywhere.
I mean, I've been facing it last year, this situation. Like, we talked with the management in my situation in Immortals, and we just had a plan going into the summer split. So it involved a lot of roster changes that, like, the audience, like, didn't really understand, and I understand why they didn't understand that. And I mean, heading into the week 2, I mean, the whole management decided that to part way with the current state of the team. So I got laid off and Keaton as well. So it kind of transitioned into, oh, okay, so I got recognized for picking, this team, and then they swapped the whole rest of the roster. So obviously, like, I mean, a huge part of the information there is missing on how it got, like, prepared and stuff during the off season. And from the outside perspective, it just doesn't look good for everyone, And I think, for instance, this year it's much better because, as I was mentioning off, is like the fact of putting Pretty for one game and saying, oh, we're putting him to give him time because we think he's performing very well. I think, for instance, the communication between last year, not putting me, I don't care, like, it's what's done is done, but I think the difference in communication is perfect, Like last year, it was kind of a mess and nobody really knew like what was happening. And this year, it's like, okay, the lineup is moving for this very specific reason, for this very specific game. And after that, we just switch back to normal. We just want to reward the well behavior of our academy player. So I think teams are learning from their mistakes as well, but definitely there is like a huge gap to close in terms of like communicating around the weaknesses of players, not making it look like they're unable to overcome them.
Sure, I agree with that.
Yeah, one thing actually I would add on to that is something you said earlier as well, where you were talking about like the idea that if it's just a flaw, like with the overall system, whatever you're trying to do is the concept, and it's something minor, but it's what the reason you're losing games. I definitely agree that like the idea that you just take a player and you sort of do label him in your mind, like, right, he's the reason it's not working. You take him out, you add another player, and you just imagine that somehow this player, who, by the way, in line with what you're saying, has had no time working on this problem, he's just walking in fresh, that just fixes the problem. Like, here's the thing, it can happen, certainly. Like I'll say in my home game, CSGO, that's basically the way you fix problems. Like, you just change players because it's an open circuit, there aren't poaching rules. If you have the money, you have the money. But I would even say in that game, it's actually, that's the extreme version of it, because think about it, in that version of a game, you don't just replace it with any random player. You probably buy one of the best players in the world who does exactly what you want. Well, you can't do that in League of Legends, like, especially not during the season. That's just not an option. So one thing I do think is a bit weird is, in my opinion, when you wait halfway through a whole split, and as like we're saying here, like, maybe you see your team's not going to make playoffs, then you do the panic swap. That's like you just take out a player, maybe even a big name player, or you just throw a player in from academy. Like, that almost to me is like you're admitting you haven't done a good job as a coach. Like, if you're the coach, as long as you're not a million miles from the premise, wouldn't you rather keep working with the person who's been there for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, you know what I mean? Because to me, if it's a massive problem, the team's probably not going to do anything in playoffs anyway, even if you change one player. If it's a minor problem, you add to the work you've done. Like, maybe this next 1 week of going through the hard times fixes it all, and now you have the awesome team that presumably you thought you had at the beginning of the split.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you have a very good example. I think 2016 Splice, where they just changed the support. They go relegation in the spring split, and they change one support. Nisbate is out, and Mihix arrives, and then they go to World. So sometimes one player is all you need to kind of like cement the whole pool of talent within your team. So you're gonna have good and bad cases in every single situation. I feel like what I'm very leaning towards, like what Wiki is saying, which is trying to phrase it in a way that it doesn't paint anyone individually bad, because I think that's a swap, an unplanned swap within a season is a collective failure. From the staff not being able to develop the player enough for him to perform and maintain like the atmosphere of the team, for the player to not have the work ethics or not knowing the work ethics enough to maintain his level or adapt to the patch or something. So it's always a collective failure, and I think it's never good as an organization to just direct all the blame towards one person or one sub part of the team, and try and. I think that teams need to learn to own it a little bit more, in a way that players can find another chance after they get benched. Because a lot of players, especially I think in ERLs and in LEC, it's even more prevalent because there is much more rookies. Like the amount of rookies going in and out of ERL is gonna just skyrocket, because for instance LFL, like the French league, is so competitive at the moment.
Sure.
There are going to be a lot of players that are going to just jump into the LEC, and after a few weeks, the management is going to say, "Oh, okay, we're just switching back to other older players." And if there is no if the teams are not owning it, then it looks terrible for everybody. Like for instance, like the Vitality case where they pulled Salut à tous SLT, which is he was a rookie, was playing in ERL. They switched him in for the early part of the summer split. They were winning and losing him, was fine, and suddenly they just brought back their top laner from the academy, which was their main top laner on the spring split, saying, "Oh, the guy in the academy is performing extremely well." The point is like, what about the rest? How are the pieces connected? What happened? What's the direction? What's the vision? You have two young players. You're just switching them in and out. We don't really understand. And they got a huge, it's not even like my opinions. They got a huge backslash from the community.
For sure, yeah.
Because there is no explanation. Like, what's the vision? Like, which one do you want to keep for the next 3 years?
Yes.
That's where I think it needs to improve.
I even think such a case, right? You have a perfect situation where you could be like, oh, the champion pool from Sagenda fits our comp better, and we don't want to play around top lane as much. We haven't played around top lane, so this fits us better, You don't even have to give much information out because that's obvious to everyone. Everyone can see it, right? And like there's been situation, even look at the C9 situation where Sven got benched or set out, and then King was in. And then suddenly the management comes out, the coaching staff, one part of it, comes out and says, oh, I don't think Sven will play this entire split. And then suddenly Sven is back. Like, what's going on? These kind of things are so crazy to me, and it's one of the reasons I don't want to watch C9 games now.
Yeah, it's just this. I mean, that's something I say to a lot of people within the industry that are not like owners of teams. In any league, you have 9 losers, right? That's how it works. So losing is the most likely outcome of your season. And if you're not winning anyway, like making 6th or 3rd, or at the end of the day, except if you go to Worlds, there is no like big outcome. Like you just go on holiday like everyone else. And I feel like it's much better for teams to sell a vision. That's what I was just like trying to mention at the beginning of this talk, is just try to sell the vision to their fans in a way that no matter what the decision is made, the fans feel like it's part of a process that's been thought ahead. And this will justify as many decisions that it needs to be taken to reach the goal that has been like shown to the fan or thought in advance. But the problem is we feel like we've just the ups and downs of like just the daily life of a season. Management try to adapt as if they're buying and selling stocks.
Yes.
And it feels very uncomfortable for the audience saying, oh, okay, we're just shorting and then we're buying this one and we're shorting.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you're in this situation and you're day trading or week trading your roster, you're usually not the team that's going to win it all at the end of the year. It happened, but usually it doesn't. So that's where maybe to take the L, cater to your vision, and keep doing. I think, for instance, one of the Thieves made an amazing job by buying the roster that was growing, keeping it steady, reinforcing it really steadily, and now they're in a position where they're actually beating the OG teams that felt like nobody could beat. Just with a very proper strategy that they started 2 years ago. Even their academy last year, Tenacity, all these guys, the scouting that has been done by Kelsey back then, the vision that has been like thought by Papa Smith. There is a lot of things that are behind the stage that you can clearly show. If you're a fan of one of the Thieves, you can be a fan of Nature and all the content creators. But if you like the esports side as well, like you feel like this team is having kind of a steady management toward a goal. And when they had to kind of like, go at the bank and get a little bit, maybe spend a little bit more to get this whole roster from GG that was the most growing one, they just got it. And usually it's C9 that gets the growing roster in NA. Yes. And this time it's 100 Thieves. So I think that's kind of like this improvement is not only communicating, but it's like giving to their audience a vision that they can cater to, even if it's like, oh, we're going to be 10th. It's fine, guys, we're going to be 10th, but we're helping NA trying players that will never get a spot in and fans maybe will like it. But this day trading feels very odd for everybody.
I've got another take on this as well, by the way. I want to open as a potential topic, which is I also feel like I'll be very cynical here, Zabatine. One of the reasons I also think sometimes coaches and orgs don't come clean with like what they were thinking is I think some of them don't actually have like a coherent plan from day one to the end of the split as to what they were trying to do. I think a lot of them do come in and it's like a day job. It's like, right, I've got these players. Here's how the meta is at the moment. Right, we're going to do these practices, see what works, boys. And it's like, and to me, that actually is also where some of the coaches and the orgs need to step their shit up, because one of the questions I have is, right, when it's again, if we're not talking about like pure player underperformance, like obviously, if I'll give you an example right now. If you recruited Kiri for this split, yeah, you're probably not very happy with how he's performing. Like you thought he was going to be a lot better than this. He's kind of hitting a lot of the games. He's probably just going to get replaced because he's bad at the moment, and that's just the way it is, right? It's nothing to do with anything extra like this. But I would say this. The people who recruit him have to ask themselves, what was I thinking when I recruited him? That has to be part of the process. Because one thing I can't handle, Zabatine, is there's a lot of people who are coaches and GMs in some of these teams that are recruiting players as all, it's like not possible to check on their history, or it's not possible to test these things. Like when I'm making the concept of the team, how my team's going to play, if, for example, I'm recruiting, so I'll use the example of SK Gaming. If I want to have a jungle support duo that's like, really great at shot calling and understands macro concepts, well then, if I want that, I've done a fucking terrible job if I was the GM of SK Gaming. Like, I don't want that guy telling me after one split Zabatine, like, oh, but I didn't know this Tinks guy was like this. Well, then you don't know anything about fucking League of Legends. If you'd gone to the RLs and you'd asked the people who played with Tinks, you'd asked even the people who were bigging him up as a player, they said he's a very good player in a certain sense. On certain champions, in a certain playing style, he could be good. He was never billed as like some mastermind. Also, he was already playing with fucking Yellowstar in the RLs. Probably, by the way, the most like notoriously amazing shot caller Europe ever produced. I'd maybe put like Mithy on the same level. Like these, when you played with someone like that, like you have to assume that that's having an impact on them. So when they don't play with them, they're not going to be as good. Like to me, I think some of these orgs have to take like. Here, I'll give you an analogy very quickly. There was a legendary football manager from the 80s and 90s in England. It was called Brian Clough, right? And what he did is he took a load of teams that on paper should never have really been like contending for the championship. And not only did he win what would have been the Premier League, it was called Division 1 back then, he also won the European Cup with these teams. And one of his amazing details of how he used to recruit people was exactly what I'm talking about. He didn't go and try and recruit the best player and then go, right, how, like essentially, here's the analogy. He didn't do what G2 did, which is like, right, we've lost an AD carry. Who's the best AD carry? Well, the best AD carry is Reckless at the moment. So get Reckless and, we'll just figure it out. Like, we've got so many good players, it'll work somehow. What he would do, literally, Zabatine, is he would, like, very cynically just say, right, in my team, for example, this is a real example he used, I want, like, a midfielder, and I don't need them to be really fast. They don't have to be able to dribble around anyone. They don't have to be able to score. All I need is, like, a holding midfielder, a guy, like, controls the midfield, links up with the defensive part. Like, so what he would do, no joke, is he would go out and get, like, some 34-year-old, like, Scottish guy who, like, everyone else thinks is washed, but he just looked and saw, oh, that guy can do exactly what I want. And he would just bring people in that sense, because what I'm trying to set up here is, at least if you come in and you know that the person can do the things you want, it might still not work, but you've got a good starting position. I feel as though a lot of coaches are almost acting like they're the school teacher and they're just getting a bunch of bright students and they're going to teach them how to play League of Legends. Like, what do you think on this, Zabatine? Because I know a lot of coaches might have a different perspective to me, so I want to see where you come down on it.
I think that there's a lot of truth in what you've said. I think that, for instance, I mean, if I take my own experience, I think that the way I've been scouting and recruiting in the past, I haven't put enough time into getting it to the microscopic detail of like what makes a player clutch or better, or the way the play side. Like, for instance, when I built IMT last year, I think that, for instance, one thing I've kind of overlooked, putting all the constraint of availability of players, money, management on the side, right? Just I'm gonna put about my own flows. I think that, for instance, I've tried to put a team where my mid laner is going to try to get rid of his laning and try to project himself towards the sides. But on the top lane, I had Soaz, that was kind of a player that wanted to play for the team and play at some point in the game. And then my bot lane was not like, super heavy, like getting all the resource on the map and trying to win the game solely from the bot lane. So I had like 3 very serviceful lanes with Xmedi, that's a very serviceful player as well, and eventually everybody was very clever about the game. But when you were watching our games, it was like, some games you felt like, there was the idea and the movement on the map were not the problem, but there was not that like this very specific idea about how you want to play the game, how do you want to win games with the players you're gonna recruit, and that has been, like, I mean, you have to take ownership for the things you've done wrong, and I think that's it's not. And people will criticize me for picking AK, for instance, but I don't think that's an AK problem. It's a me problem of, if I pick AK, I need to find a system where I can actually express his main key strength as a player, and I think that, of course, what you say is true, right? But no, I'm gonna just include another dimension into this. Is like, it has to come not only for the coaching staff, but as well from the vision of the company above. And for instance, what the FIFA have been doing, which is extremely good, is they've tried to invest a lot. You remember that the year that they invested on Bang, and there was like this whole team, and like, I mean, you import Bang, it's a key player, and they actually didn't win. They didn't worse in 2019 than they did in 2018 spring when they had Milios and stuff. So what it shows is they switched vision and were like, okay, we're gonna just play it patient and try to go for like growing players, and when I try to have this play style, and when they saw the GG team and they got it, I think they made probably one of the smartest moves I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years in LCS, because instead of assembling team, because you're in NA, you have the visa issues. You cannot try out people. Like, this is impossible with import. That's impossible. Like, if someone tells you like it's possible, they're probably lying, or they have a super system that nobody knows about. So because you can't try, the best thing you can do is getting something out of the box that you're gonna just refine, and it's exactly what they did. So I will give you this. I think it's very important, and if I ever do a coaching job in the future, that's something I will always remember. It's the mistake of just trying to put players position per position, and not having a kind of a steady vision of like what I want to do, when I want to win, and how do I want to win, which are the two main question you need to answer. And your management as well behind you needs to back you, and understand like, oh, when are we gonna win? And they don't come after week 4 saying we're 10th. Yeah, but because it can be part of the process to be 10th for a certain amount of time. Like GG, for instance, they don't really look to win. Like, they had a winning roster, they just swapped it. At some point, you don't seem that GG wants to go for for the first place, but they're doing a favor to, I think, the ecosystem to some extent. So that's where I think what you say is very true. Is you need to have, as once again going back at it, you need as an organization to own a vision, and have the people that can scout, people that like profiles that you need according to your main coaching staff that doesn't have the time to do that, and kind of recruit and train players that cater to your play style. Otherwise, you sell them. And then you have kind of a play style, and fans can relate to, oh, okay, I'm playing for, I don't know, like TSM, and TSM is the team that is playing with like their superstar ADC. I'm always gonna play toward the ADC or the mid lane or whatsoever. That's I agree with you on that point. Yeah.
I think something very smart you said is also about the company. One thing I think is, when you get a coach, it's very important that the coach knows exactly what kind of position he's in. Is he actually a coach that got control of the team, or is he just a puppet that's just there because you need to fill a coaching role, right? Because there have been the past where there's just people that needed to fill the role, and it wasn't really that important who it was. For example, I had a Dota player as a coach at one point in Elements, I think. So it does happen, but I think it's very important. And I think if a company doesn't back their coach, then why do you have a coach in the first place, right? Besides just requiring to have one.
Yes. Yeah, and on top of that, it's like head coach is a position that's very misunderstood from pretty much everybody in the industry, whether it's staff. Like, the people that recruit head coach don't really understand like the job. And usually, like, even the definition of a staff is so flexible from one team to the other that it's very hard. Like, the expectations coming from the companies are usually very unrealistic. Like, I was alone on my first year, and I would never work alone, for instance, ever again, because it doesn't make sense. And you have staff with 20 people, and you're like, you are more than for a soccer team. So organizing this whole workforce and making sure that everybody caters to the vision that the company has, with the timeline allowed by the I would say the ownership of the team, is super, super important. And I feel like as a previous staff, you don't always feel like it's the case, but when it does, it feels grand. And then this is the time where you actually see teams outperforming. You feel like they're not going to do great, and they're actually doing great.
Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.